When education reform was adopted 25 years ago, the state was committed to improving student performance and closing achievement gaps. Despite some gradual improvements overall, school districts still have problems with achievement gaps according to race and income level. And as outlined in a new report from the Mass Budget and Policy Center, the formula that governs state funding for local school districts needs an update. To tell us about the report is our guest from the center, the senior policy analyst, Colin Jones. Thank you very much for being with us, Colin.
Thanks for having me.
Professor Colin, talk about what it is that really needs to be updated in this formula.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, ed reform goes back to 25 years ago when the Ed Reform Act was first passed. And it did a lot of important things. So it increased state investment in schools, and it progressively distributed more of that aid to the cities that weren't able to sort of raise funding locally. And so, but just like anything else, after a number of years, it definitely needs updating, and it's not able to really do everything that we needed to do today. And so particularly the areas that have been identified are making sure we have enough supports for low-income students, making sure we support English language learners separately from that, and then Two key factors are just more expensive than we predicted 25 years ago, and that's health insurance for staff and then special education. And that's not really the fault of schools. These are just things that across the economy, healthcare is more expensive than it was back in the early 90s. And then with special education, it's good and it's important to be serving kids with special needs, but it just is more expensive than we accounted for.
And it might be good to clarify from the report, this isn't just about students with special needs whose parents are better at gaming the system. I mean, there are simply more needs out there.
Yeah, there are more needs out there, and those are things that we are required to make sure that kids have the least restrictive environment. And it definitely should not be something about playing one-sided parents against each other, but it's about how do we make sure that all of our kids, regardless of their background, regardless of their needs, and actually regardless of where they're born, they're getting a great education. And so our new report, what's not news to many is that we do have a problem with our funding system. So these problems have been known for over 10 years. And there was a recent state commission in 2015 that really outlined, okay, what are the areas that we need to fix, those 4 areas I mentioned. And unfortunately, that hasn't turned into legislation and new funding. And so the purpose of our report was to really say, okay, we know what the problems are, how do you actually fix it? And at a high level, we found that it would take roughly $890 million over the next 5 years to address all those areas and properly fund the system. And so that is a lot of money, but it's also, we are a state that has the capability to raise that, and we have years to get it done. And so hopefully, having those numbers out there will help the process as we try to get that into legislation and get that done for kids.
Well, as you noted, the places that need the most help from the state are the local communities that have the lowest tax base.
Yep.
Boston has a robust tax base, but we also have a lot of needs. So where do you see Boston in this?
Yeah, so Boston definitely has a unique profile. So the students it serves are very much like the kids in gateway cities. So you have high numbers of low-income kids, English language learners, but the tax base is actually among the wealthiest across the state. And so, Boston has an interest in making sure that those low-income kids and those English language learner students, they're properly accounted for. So their interests actually align pretty well with the gateway cities. But because of the wealth that exists in the city, it's expected to give more of the required funding in the system is expected to come from the city in Boston's case. And so you actually need to do more dramatic change before you begin to actually generate new funding for the city. So when we looked at simulations to do this, it wasn't until you added really all 4 of those pieces, English language learners, low income, healthcare, and special education, before you begin to see new money coming into the city. If those things were addressed, it would be at least $30 million more for the city of Boston over 5 years, and it could be as much as 130, depending on how it's done. So, I think it is definitely a live conversation in Boston. It's a little bit more of a simple story in, say, the Gateways, Revere, and Chelsea, where as soon as you begin to increase the allotments in the formula, they begin to get a lot of aid quickly.
What about those health insurance costs for teachers and other staff? I mean, has there been any ideas about how to maybe put the brakes on those without going too far, of course?
Yeah, I mean, healthcare cost containment, I mean, that could be a whole other show. I mean, it's a clear issue across government. It's a greater expense in our state budget, although some of that, of course, is covered by the federal government. So It's definitely something where it's because schools are a personnel-driven business, and you have this fixed cost that continues to grow. It's become more of a problem, and so I think what we were looking at was actually not raising the formula to give everything that districts are spending today. It's just to bring it closer to sort of reality. So. But there are ways, there's things like, the bigger the health insurance pool, for instance, the more savings you get. And so I think there's ways that if school leaders, policymakers and unions and everyone involved really gets it together at the table and there's more funding on the table, we can come up with ways to, continue having good health insurance, but try to bring costs down. And if you can do that, that's more hopefully freed up for the classroom. And the reality is that those costs exist today. They're just not properly covered. And so what ends up happening is schools with fixed costs are pulling out of things like teachers. They're pulling out of materials, supplies. We're seeing things like, especially in the gateway cities, a return to like 30 or 40 kids in a classroom. We're meeting in a library. We're seeing more teachers raising funds online for basic supplies. And so those costs exist today. If we free them up, it's not as simple as, oh, this is all just going to go to health insurance. Actually, it's going to free up, to go to the things that we want to focus on, and those are, making sure that teachers are properly trained and, getting high-quality career technical and increasing preschool. So if we actually invest in the system, we should expect that, more of those reforms are going to be taking place, and it won't be this cycle of just budget cuts every year. And I know Boston Public Schools goes through that.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Colin Jones from the Mass Budget and Policy Center. Colin, what about that? Because in Boston, as you mentioned, we have these budget cuts every year, but every year the city keeps increasing its own contribution to the school system. So how do you account for that?
Well, to some extent, the city of Boston is treated as a wealthy city under the funding formula. So it's expected to give upwards of 80% of its required school spending, just because it has the wealth to do so. But it is true that some forms of aid, state aid, which is called Chapter 70, hasn't been growing that fast. And then as students in Boston actually have left to charter schools, there's been reimbursements that have been basically cut in half. And so that has meant, each year there's a tough budget environment. And so I think reforming the system can be part of the conversation. So many years the budget gap of Boston is in the $30 to $50 million range, and if you update Chapter 70 after 5 years, there'll be 30 to as much as 130 in new aid for the city. So that's definitely part of the conversation. But it's also true that the city needs to find resources, on its own in terms of property taxes due to development or other sources to fund their schools. And so it's always going to be a partnership between the city and the state to fund the Boston Public Schools, and updating the formula and getting this done is certainly going to help that.
Another gap that people are looking at more closely now in Boston is in access to quality schools. It's almost like a new version of the old racial gap. Yeah. And people are saying, oh, we're spending all this money on busing. I mean, we could be spending at least some of that in the classroom. Now, does that have something to do with the state problem that you're looking at?
Well, I think that it's indirect. And so I think that, if you do update the state law, more money is coming into the city in terms of aid. And so that means that hopefully that money is going to be used to do school improvement across the board. And I think the end goal, busing is extremely complicated. There's PhDs over at MIT trying to run simulations of how to run the buses and things of that nature. But I think the simple point is we need to make sure that more schools in all of our neighborhoods are performing at a high level. And if they're cutting teachers, if they're cutting librarians, if they're just trying to meet the bare minimum, they're less likely to do that. And so I think that the busing regime could be improved or modernized, but I think the long term is let's make sure every single school is of high quality. And I think there's unequal access, and I think the simplest way is to make sure more schools are improving, make sure the schools are attracting great teachers, make sure they're offering, parents don't get out of work at 3, so making sure they're extending learning time, turning around the career technical education in the city, which we're in the middle of a biotech and technology hub, so we should be having world-class technical education in the city of Boston. So there's a number of things that we should pursue. This will help that, and I think I think that's where the focus should be. How do we make sure, and this is obviously something that's facing the new leadership at the Boston Public Schools, is how do we not just make it isolated cases or hoping you win the lottery, but making sure that more kids just in their neighborhoods and overall that every school in the city is excellent. So that's a uphill battle. It's going to take work, but.
One of our local state senators, Sonya Chang Diaz, was leading the effort to get more funding. She was on the commission about the foundation budget. She came out with a very big figure. There's a lot of support in the Senate. Didn't do so well in the House. And it sounds like something that is just going to be out of reach. We're not going to have that millionaire's tax, so we've got to have the money for this.
So I think that those are valid concerns. I think that, however, I mean, we have a great tradition. We're one of those states that's always been leading the country in education. We're even competitive globally, but we continue to have achievement gaps that are some of the largest in the country. So, I think there's a general belief that we should have an excellent education system. Every kid should be getting a great school experience that sets them up for success in their career and beyond. So, how to do that? There's a lot of details that go into how to do that, and I think. The legislature's had various bills talking about updating this funding. They're actually right now in the middle of trying to settle those differences and figure out what the long-term plan is. I think a couple things to keep in mind. There are big numbers, but the state budget in Massachusetts is $45 billion. So and we also have a strong economy right now where revenue is coming actually ahead of projections. And so what we typically do every year is we add about $100 million to the system. Well, if you're doing, the most expensive thing that we looked at was about $1 billion over 5 years. So that's 200. So you've got to find that difference somewhere, and there's growing revenue to do that. I think there's other measures that we can look at that are still progressive. There isn't going to be, as you know, a ballot question on education revenue or transit revenue. But the underlying point that we need to invest in our schools, we need to invest in transit and other things, we need to reduce the cost of college. We need to expand the number of kids in preschool. Those are still valid. I think there's still wide public support for those things. And so things like looking at some of the tax breaks that we have, I think looking at some of the special treatment of business income and things like that. There's technical areas we can look at. So it's going to be part of our ongoing conversation. But we don't have to do it all overnight, and we do have the capacity.
Thank you very much for being with us.
All right, thank you.
Colin Jones from the Mass Budget and Policy Center.